You are listening to the 11th module of the International Security course. In this module, we have quite a bit of material to cover, so this will probably be a fairly lengthy talk here. The first part of this section will focus on environmental security with a particular focus on population, resource depletion, and climate change. And in the second half, we will tackle a related topic with regards to securing oceans and the freedom of navigation. And to give us a sense of where we're at vis-a-vis what we've talked about before with regards to human security, we began by talking about the importance of civic security, protecting political and civil rights. But we also asked the question in the last module, what's the use of protecting these rights if people live in poverty, if they can't exercise or even care about exercising these rights, if they live in poverty and aren't sure where their next meal is coming from. And we can ask a similar question with regards to environmental security. Once we've acquired our civic rights and we've created sufficient amounts of wealth to protect our economic rights, what good are these rights if we are living in a world that is threatened with some kind of environmental catastrophe? If the threat of global warming is so great that the ability to generate wealth is no longer possible. The ability to enjoy wealth and the ability to enjoy our civic rights is threatened by the consequences of a warming planet or a dwindling amount of resources, especially energy, which is necessary to power a robust economy. So, as I hope you're seeing here, the ability to enjoy one set of rights requires us to address other sets of rights simultaneously. And environmental security is no different. If we want to secure one set or a couple other sets of human rights and privileges of human security, we have to address the environment and the threat to the environment. And indeed, states themselves have an interest in addressing these problems because destruction of the biosphere and the threats posed by climate change aren't just a threat to the human community, but they're a threat to states as well. The consequences of environmental degradation pose a threats to states as well. If we look at the problem of resource depletion and the importance of certain resources related to energy especially, and the lack of access to those resources, that poses a threat to the national interest of the states. If they can't get access to the energy they need because of dwindling reserves, that's going to inhibit their ability to produce economic abundance. And it's going to require them to act in an aggressive way to use their military capability to invade, to conquer, to control certain parts of the world where those dwindling resources are located. This explains the interest in the Middle East by the United States and other powerful states, because obviously there's a great deal of oil that's there as a result of the accident of nature. If we think about climate change and the possibility that things like rising ocean levels are going to displace large numbers of migrant communities. As we saw at the end of 2015 with the migrant problem that emerged in Europe, the population of Syria and Afghanistan and other states that were collapsing civically, we saw those populations, when they moved in mass into Europe, create a security problem, create a problem in terms of European states not being able to deal with or unwilling to deal with or not wanting to deal with these mass migrations. And this problem is related to the idea of governments that when they deal with these populations, or even the problems of their own populations not being able to sustain themselves economically, this leaves them vulnerable to attacks, to exploitation, to intrigues by other states that might take advantage of their weakness. Of course, there is a threat to the human security posed by the environment, environmental degradation. Obviously, a biosphere that is reduced in its viability is a threat to human life. People don't have the ability to live in certain parts of the world where they did before. That's going to cause these migrations. But those who stick around, or those who can't escape, those who can't leave, are at risk of succumbing to the extreme climate and extreme weather patterns that might emerge. The destruction of land that's used for agriculture, that's flooded due to rising ocean levels or due to desertification, will cause spikes in food prices and scarcity of water. And we talked about already how water is a scarce resource that many people don't have access to. So how will the destruction of aspects of the environment contribute to this problem and make it worse? And of course, as we've seen, when you don't have access to clean water, that creates a risk with regards to health and nutrition and other related health issues. So this problem of environmental degradation is a very large one that requires the entire world as a whole to address. Environmental security has many facets. We're going to focus on three here. One, the problem of rising population. Two, the problem of resource conflicts. And three, the problem of climate change. Let's begin with population growth. We've seen, as the chart suggests, an exponential rise in global population over the last few decades. Whereas back in pre-industrial times, the world's population was more or less steady and stable, the advent of industrialization has allowed for an exponential boost in the total number of people in the world. A lot of this is due to advancing technologies, the divisions of labor, the ability to produce more food from smaller amounts of land. All these things are very good, and this is not a criticism of the fact there's too many people on the planet. But it is a issue when these people, in order to realize their civic and economic rights, require a certain amount of develop and wealth in order to enjoy life and realize their rights to their fullest. And this becomes increasingly difficult to provide given the finite amount of key resources. The most obvious of this is our resources related to energy production, primarily petrochemicals like oil and natural gas and what have you. But as we see technologies advance and these technologies expand to parts of the world that didn't have access to them before, things like computers and smartphones and automobiles, this places a lot of pressure to produce lots of rare earth metals, to mine them and to use them in the production of these electronic devices. And so there's a lot of pressure to gain access to these resources, to harvest them and put them in the productive process so that more people can enjoy the benefits and fruits of these technologies. As you can see from the chart, current population sits around 8 billion people. We're obviously between the year 2000 and the year 2050. Right now, we've got around 8 billion people in the world, and that number is anticipated to rise to 10 billion by the year 2050. At this point, it gets there's a lot of debate, I should say, about whether this rise in population will continue to spike or if it will stabilize as countries that suffer from an overabundance of population in terms of their inability to sustain the population that exists there. If as they develop economically, that population will stabilize. Because one of the things we notice, and you can see in the chart here, is that industrialized countries don't see population spikes the same way developing countries do. So the key to solving this problem goes back to a little bit we talked about last time, the importance of economic development. Once you develop nations economically, once they create a middle class in their society, you see a lot, families having a lot fewer children. You see men and women less interested necessarily in having kids and more focused on careers and whatnot, don't have as many children. And this causes the populations to stabilize a bit. The other argument is that these trends are set in stone for the time being, and that it's possible that we'll see, in the next 100 years, the population spike to 10, 20, even 30 billion people by the year 2100, which would place a great deal of pressure on countries that don't have the ability, can't produce the resources to sustain these large populations. In many cases, it's not even clear the entire Earth has enough resources in aggregate to support a world that has 30 billion people in it. One of the concepts that's important to understand when talking about population growth is the notion of carrying capacity. And then basically each state has a certain carrying capacity that's calculated based on its level of development. So some states might have a large carrying capacity, but their population is well below that carrying capacity, so there's a surplus of resources that the state can sell off or use for investment or some other type of purpose. Other states, however, have a population that exceeds their carrying capacity, exceeds the amount of resources necessary to sustain that population, and these states obviously are challenged to get those resources from somewhere else, especially if they're poor states that can't afford to import the resources they need from other parts of the world. When you have countries that have exceeded their carrying capacities, this leads to migration. This leads to people trying to escape these countries in search of economic opportunities elsewhere. And this creates tension because oftentimes these surplus populations become stateless people. They become immigrants who oftentimes don't care about the niceties of immigration law in their pursuit of finding economic opportunities elsewhere. And this contributes to other problems like debates about how does a state deal with an influx of so-called illegal immigrants who, again, are not disincentivized from entering a state illegally due to the threats of punishment because they violate immigration laws. Think back to what we talked about at the beginning of the lecture. If you're starving, if you don't have any economic opportunity, you don't know where your next meal is coming from, the threat of going to jail because you violated another state's immigration laws is not a disincentive to immigration. Indeed, the discussion of excess population inevitably leads us to the very closely related discussion of resource depletion. That the real problem with too many people or a population that exceeds the world's carrying capacity isn't, again, with the people themselves, but with the inability to sustain the population in a way that doesn't lead to chronic poverty. We see states tackle this problem in many different ways, some more successfully than others. States like China have implemented things like a one-child policy in the past in an attempt to deal with excess or rising populations and not want those populations to exceed the ability of the state to provide resources for them. States that have carrying capacities beyond their ability to produce resources see reserves begin to dwindle. And when reserves begin to dwindle, not just within those states, but in the world as a whole, you reintroduce some of the ideas we've talked about at the very beginning of the course, the idea of states pursuing national interests. And if it's in the national interest of a state to go find resources elsewhere in the world and to take them by force if necessary, you see how resource depletion leads to interstate conflict. And the easiest way to understand how a resource conflict emerges is to look at the problem of oil. And historically, one of the ways of dealing with the problem of finite amounts of oil reserves is to discuss this concept of peak oil. The concept refers here to the idea that at some point in the near future, the amount of demand for oil will exceed and will forever succeed the amount of supply that's available. 10 years ago, it was believed that we were at or near this peak oil point, that at some point as China and India and Brazil and other developing countries, as their demand for oil increased, that demand that exists when you add these developing countries' demand to the already existing demand would forever exceed the ability of supplies to meet that demand. And that eventually oil prices would begin to skyrocket because oil will become increasingly a very precious resource because demand would always outstrip supply. And as those supplies dwindle, those prices would go up. And at some point, this theory argues, states would make the calculation that rather than spend all this money trying to gain access to expensive oil in an international oil market, it would be more cost effective to physically go and control these areas and gain access to the resources that way, essentially neo-imperialism, if you will. This chart shows one estimation of peak oil. And as you can see here, the curves represent, an upward movement to a point where peak oil is hit, and then those supplies dwindle precipitously. You'll also notice the chart identifies peak oil being reached in the year 2004. It's obviously now the year 2017, and we haven't hit peak oil yet. So this concept is problematic in that many of those who offered up and argued this model were also at the same time arguing that peak oil was something that was imminent, that it was here, it was now, and if we didn't deal with it, we would be in a world of trouble. And obviously that hasn't been the case. And we'll explain why in the next slide. Before we do that, though, let's pause a moment and look at the invasion of Iraq. Because there's a very powerful argument that says the invasion of Iraq has nothing to do with weapons of mass destruction, has nothing to do with human rights protections, has nothing to do with protecting freedom in the Middle East or protecting Israel or whatever other excuse was offered, justification was offered for that war. The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was purely about oil. And again, if you think back to 2003, when peak oil was a more powerful concept, this has a certain kernel of truth to it, that it was important to secure sources of oil when the conventional wisdom at this time said that the supply of oil was doomed to drop precipitously in the near future. So the invasion of Iraq in 2003 is about securing, in the case of Iraq, the country that has the second largest amount of known oil reserves in the world. And if you look at the initial steps by the US military when it entered Baghdad, what was the first building the military forces went to protect? It was the oil ministry building. While the rest of Baghdad was literally being looted, museums were being looted, office buildings of various government buildings were being looted or destroyed or stripped of anything that was valuable in them. The oil ministry building didn't get a single, scratch. Why is that? Because that's where all the maps were. That's where all the contracts were stored. That's where all the information about Iraqi oil reserves was kept. And the U.S. wanted to be sure that information wasn't destroyed or fall into the wrong hands. With oil, there's also the problem of OPEC and the ability of this cartel to manipulate the price of oil. And so by toppling Saddam Hussein, who was a big advocate of artificially changing the price of oil in the interest of OPEC countries and not necessarily in the interest of Western consumer states, it was important to put a government in place in Iraq that would be more amenable to the interest of Western countries, especially the United States, and make sure that oil was always cheap and priced fairly, quote unquote. But as I mentioned, peak oil, the worst predictions of peak oil have not come about. So why is this the case? Largely because new technologies came online. Technologies like hydraulic fracking, technologies like deep water drilling, technologies that allowed us to get access to oil reserves that were not easily accessible before. And when we developed these technologies, we being, non-oil producing states, when these technologies were developed, we found that there's a lot more oil we can get access to than we thought. There's a lot more natural gas that we can get access to than we thought. And we get access to it now pretty cheaply, to the point now where no one's really worried about peak oil anymore, that between our ability to produce more oil and the trend towards conservation and reducing demand by switching to other alternative fuels, no one's really worried about the world running out of oil anymore. There's still the problem with climate change and the byproducts and waste products of burning petroleum. We'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of supplies, we're not really worried about peak oil anymore. This is because, again, new technologies, because of conservation, making cars more efficient, using natural gas to power cities and other types of electricity generation rather than oil and petroleum, and the ability to develop alternative sources of energy, solar, wind, biofuels, all sorts of renewable sources that together allow us to substitute the burning of fossil fuels for energy production. And there's every reason to believe that these technologies, these renewable energy sources, will become cheaper in the future, mitigating the threat of oil resource depletion with regards to oil even more. And before we move on to climate change, I also want to point out that there are other resources where scarcity might be an issue, and these are resources you might not normally expect. For example, there's a problem with water scarcity around the world, and this scarcity comes in basically two forms. One is physical scarcity. This is what happens when certain parts of the world that tend to be arid see lots of development, see lots of an influx of population and settlement. And this exceeds the ability of the land, the biosphere in this part of the world, to produce enough water to sustain the population. And it turns out a place like Fort Collins is in one of these scarcity zones that, Western or Colorado, Western and the eastern part, is facing challenges with regards to having access to sufficient amounts of water. Not so much in terms of the population that lives in Colorado itself, but the fact that so much of the runoff from the Rockies is claimed by cities that are further downstream on the Colorado River. Cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix and the coastal Southern California all rely on water coming out of the Rocky Mountains down the Colorado River watershed. And so if there's a dry winter that doesn't produce a lot of snow, this becomes a problem, not just, again, for people in the ski industry in Colorado, but for tens of millions of people who live downstream and won't have the same amount of water coming down the river to irrigate crops, to water lawns, to ensure everyone has enough to drink and to shower with, and all the other things we rely on water for. The other part of water scarcity is what's called economic scarcity. And here we're talking about the developing world and something we talked about in the last module with regards to economic security. The fact that potable water is not available to people in certain parts of the world, not because there's no water there, not because it's dry. There's plenty of water available, but it's not clean, it's not potable, it's either tainted or it's raw, or there's something that it prevents the local population from drinking it, from consuming it, from using it without risking disease or other types of negative consequences. Much of sub-Saharan Africa falls into this category. It's a very lush part of the world. As you see pictures of it, and perhaps you've been there, you know that it's a very lush green part of the world. There's plenty of water available, but it's not drinkable. It's not potable. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be treated. And those facilities are in very short supply. So you have a problem with economic security. Plenty of water, but no, not the ability actually to consume it. Now we come to the biggest problem with regards to environmental security, the problem of global climate change. And there's three aspects to this problem. First, what is the problem with climate change itself? In theory, the climate changes, the weather patterns change. Why is this a problem? Certain places that it rains a lot, doesn't rain as much, and places where it doesn't rain, it rains more. What's the big deal? What are the obstacles to solving the problem, if this is the big problem that it's presented as? And given that it's been very difficult to solve the problem, what hope is there in the future that these obstacles can be overcome? Or is this going to kill us all eventually? Are we all doomed? So what's the problem itself? You probably understand or have a sense of what the problem is with regards to climate change, but we'll go briefly through the problem in sort of its scientific manifestation. In industrialization, the burning of fossil fuels is the most common way of producing energy, to power plants, to drive cars, to heat residences and businesses, and a host of other activities. The problem is burning these fossil fuels creates carbon dioxide and other types of gases that, when they go up into the atmosphere, create a greenhouse effect. In essence, they allow light and heat energy to enter the Earth's atmosphere, but they don't allow it to escape. Before you had these concentrations of greenhouse gases, light and heat energy would enter the Earth. It would warm the Earth, make it habitable, but then would be reflected back out into space. With these CO2 gases and methane and other types of greenhouse gases, it allows this energy in, it doesn't allow it to escape. This heat energy is trapped and it accumulates, and eventually the temperature of the Earth goes up, resulting in shifting the weather patterns and ultimately the climate. The records that we have available to us are pretty clear in terms of the increase in global temperature. Depending on where you take the measurements, the increase in global temperature in comparison with the pre-industrial mean is between a half degree Celsius to a full degree Celsius. These numbers are a little bit old. The numbers are more between 0.5 and 1 degree Celsius increase. That in and of itself is not a problem. The trend, however, indicates that we are on a track to see as much as 5 or 6 degrees Celsius increase in the pre-industrial global mean. The problem is that scientists tell us at 5 degrees Celsius increase over pre-industrial global mean, we reach a point of no return, in that the damage done by the increase in global temperature will be irreversible, and that we won't be able to adjust or make any kind of changes in our behaviors to undo the damage. So things like the melting of the polar ice caps, the melting of the permafrost, the releasing of deep ocean algae, all these things that would have very devastating consequences on the biosphere would be irreversible once the global mean temperature increases 5 degrees over its pre-industrial norm. The first attempt to tackle this problem globally was the Kyoto Protocol that was passed in 1999. It set a target of only a 3 degrees Celsius increase, which was considered a fairly radical target at the time. As we'll see in a moment, however, the Kyoto Protocol was more or less ignored. So again, we talk about this 5-degree increase over pre-industrial global mean. What happens when you reach that point? And as I suggested, you have a host of impacts that become irreversible. One is rising sea levels. Again, you have the polar ice caps melt that represents a substantial amount of water that, when it is melted, actually raises the level of oceans around the world. And you might think, well, surely that oceans are huge, that can't possibly happen. Can't be that big of a deal. And yeah, it's only going to be a few inches. But think about low-lying areas around the world. Think about islands in the Pacific, which don't have any real mass to them, don't have any real altitude to them. They're basically coral reefs and sandbars. The oceans rising a few inches turns out to be sufficient to flood much of those islands. Also consider that most of the world's population lives next to the coast, lives on the coastal land, which means they live next to the ocean, and they live in cities that oftentimes are built in low-lying areas. Think about New Orleans. Think about countries like Bangladesh, where you have most of the population of that state living in river deltas that are easily inundated with floodwater. You add hurricanes to the mix, you add storm surges, you add tides to alter the level of oceans, and a couple inches suddenly becomes a couple feet. And this is enough to flood cities, flood countries, flood low-lying areas, flood villages, and create a whole mess of problems. In other parts of the world, the increase in temperature leads to heat waves and desertification of the land, making it less capable of sustaining agriculture. Where in the past you could grow certain crops with the aid of irrigation, if things become too hot, if too dry, even irrigation won't be sufficient to allow these crops to be raised, to allow this agriculture to be pursued. And finally, the increase in the amount of energy in the atmosphere will contribute to the intensification of storms. As the global mean temperature increases, it will result in warmer ocean temperatures. And hopefully, as we've seen with this last hurricane season that featured at least 3 major hurricanes, 2 of which struck American territory and more or less devastated the island nations of the Caribbean. States like Dominica and Barbados are just absolutely destroyed by these hurricanes. This is going to be a more regularly occurring phenomenon because hurricanes are more empowered and are formed more easily and are more intense when they have warmer water to draw energy from. So global warming leads to warmer ocean temperatures, which then leads to more intense hurricanes and other types of storms. It should be clear why this is a problem, but even if we need to take another step to see the political consequences, I think it's useful to do that. We've already talked about mass migration, and if we remind ourselves that most of the world's population lives next to oceans, lives on coastal areas, sometimes coastal areas that are prone to flooding. You can see how it doesn't take much to create a mass migration crisis, where millions of people are forced to leave homes in coastal areas and move into highlands and uplands, which aren't equipped to deal with an influx of millions of people. And sometimes, again, in places like Bangladesh, to move to higher ground means having to cross an international boundary from Bangladesh into India. Well, the Indians don't want to deal with a mass migration of Bangladeshis. They don't have the resources to deal with it. They already have their own problems with underdevelopment in that part of the world. So the last thing they need is an influx of millions of people who are looking for food, for shelter, for a place to stay while they wait for the water to go back down. We talked about the problem of desertification and the changes in weather patterns affecting agriculture. This will cause food supplies to dwindle. It will cause the prices of food to increase, meaning people who can barely afford to purchase food now will no longer be able to purchase that food and will be forced to turn to more desperate measures to acquire that food. In some cases, people may in fact starve to death. And even looking at it from from an economic point of view, beyond a subsistence economy, the ability to produce a consumer economy is disrupted when you have environmental problems. The ability to create wealth, to create a middle class economy, to transport oil, to keep the power on. If you look at the island of Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico was a developed island. It's American territory. It was not some poverty famished island like some of its neighboring islands were, and yet it's still reeling from the impacts of Hurricane Maria. So what's been done to deal with these problems? A few years ago, I might have said not much, but as I'll explain in a moment, that may not be the case anymore. The first real step was the Global Climate Change Treaty signed in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil in 1992. This treaty didn't do much but acknowledged the danger, but it was an important first step. Every journey begins with a single step, and this was the first step in this process. In 1999, you had the Kyoto Protocol, which, as we already saw, set quotas on carbon reduction designed to keep the mean global temperature from rising only 3 degrees Celsius. The US was actually a major promulgator of this protocol, but it unsigned it in 2001 when George W. Bush was elected on the argument that it would inhibit American economic development. In the meantime, the United Nations formed something called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This panel was important because for the first time you had a major international body claim and attempt to prove that climate change was anthropocentric, which is to say that it was human-made. It wasn't just some weird anomaly taking place in global weather patterns that was going to reverse itself eventually. It was the result of human activity. And this was an important step because it allowed a consensus to be created among the world community that this is our problem we have to deal with and we have to cooperate in order to deal with it. But there was also fierce opposition from certain groups who were skeptical about this conclusion. And they argued that what was causing climate change, or the variables that were contributing to climate change, could be explained other ways. For example, the idea that Earth goes through cooling and warming cycles that sometimes can last several thousand years. And there's really no way of knowing if this is just another one of those warming cycles. Those who argue this point, in fact, like to remind people that 30 years ago, during the late 60s and 70s, everyone was terrified about global cooling because the data that was available in the first part of the 20th century showed a trend downward in global temperature, that things had actually were cooling off compared to the previous decades. This is explained by the fact that there's actually more pollution in the air at the time that was blocking out the solar energy, which resulted in a slight decrease in global temperatures. And that once you cleaned up the air, ironically, you actually made yourself more vulnerable to climate change caused by global warming. Another argument designed to sort of take the blame away from humanity was the idea that nature emits a great deal of carbon naturally. That if you calculate all the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases emitted naturally through photosynthesis or other types of natural activities, it actually dwarfs what humans produce in terms of their carbon output. In this case, 200 billion tons annually through natural processes versus humans producing 7 billion tons annually. The argument here is that, well, yes, nature produces 200 billion tons of of greenhouse gases annually, but the Earth knows how to handle 200 billion tons of greenhouse gases annually. It can't handle the additional tonnage that humanity puts on top of that. There's a very fine balance that nature has learned has reached that is destroyed by adding slightly more tonnage to the mean total. It's like the idea of, your blood alcohol content, that, you drink a couple beers, you are still below the legal limit to drive, that you can still drive home without getting arrested. But that once you go over that, then it becomes a problem, then you're affected. It's the same idea here. That up to a certain point, nature can handle the amount of greenhouse gases. When you go over that, then there's a problem. Then you have negative effects. You also have an argument that says that certain astrophysical phenomenon are the result of climate change. Things like sunspot activity, which results in more solar energy being emitted, which means that the Earth is impacted by an increase or boost in solar radiation, solar energy, which will cause the temperature to rise. Another one is the wobble of the Earth, that when the Earth spins on its axis, it wobbles a bit. And sometimes when it wobbles, it actually is closer to the sun, and that is enough to see the increase in global warming or climate change. A lot of this has been debunked. Some of it has some purchase, but generally speaking, in the scientific community, consensus is climate change is anthropocentric. It turns out, however, that the real threat to a consensus on climate change around the world isn't so much the skepticism with regards to whether climate change is real or not, or whether it's anthropocentric or not. It's about the inability of states to come to any kind of agreement on how to deal with the problem. Prior to 2015, the closest the world came was the Copenhagen Protocol, which came to a head in the negotiations came to a head in 2009, the end of 2009. The problem is that there were two factions of states that were arguing that each had a responsibility that they were neglecting in trying to come to an agreement on the problem. Developing nations argued that they had a right to essentially pollute the Earth and their own state as part of their developmental process, that they point to the developing world and say, you got to trash the environment and spew black smoke into the atmosphere when you were developing. We get the same right. We get the we should be able to pollute in order to develop our economies. The only caveat to that was that they were willing to make commitments to reduce greenhouse gases if the developing countries would pay them compensation for the lack of development that would take place, and give them technologies that would allow them to produce factories and power plants that were more environmentally friendly. The rest, or the developing worlds, basically said, we're not going to give you money. We're not going to give you our technologies that we researched and have patents on just for free. You're going to have to pay us. You have to compensate us for those or purchase them legitimately. And we're simply not going to just hand over billions of dollars in order out of the goodness of our hearts on a weak promise that you're going to pledge to reduce your greenhouse gases. And finally, that we still need to develop our economies as well. And if you're not going to make commitments to reduce greenhouse gases, then we're not going to either. This, of course, led to a humorous moment during the Copenhagen debates where Hugo Chavez said that if the global climate was a bank, we would already have saved it. And keep in mind, this is 2009, right? Where we're not even a year past the global financial crisis. And the world international community spent trillions of dollars to bail out the banks. Yet the threat of climate change and the devastating consequences of climate change and the threat to life and limb didn't move the international community in the same way. Didn't move them to spend the gobs of money that they spent bailing out banks. And whatever you think of Chavez, he sort of has a point here. However, there are reasons to be hopeful. And to see why this hope, springs eternal in this case, is to look at the problem of the ozone layer, another environmental problem that 20 years ago was the major cause of concern internationally. The ozone layer is a layer of ozone gas in the upper atmosphere that blocks out ultraviolet light from the sun. The problem was, in this case, the ozone layer was being depleted by the production and emission of chlorofluorocarbons, hereafter referred to as CFCs, that were rising into the atmosphere as the result of the production of certain household products like air conditioners and turns out hairspray, that the aerosol had CFCs in it. These CFCs would go up into the atmosphere and they would literally eat away the ozone layer and allow the more ultraviolet light to penetrate the atmosphere and reach the Earth's surface, where they would cause things like skin cancer, skin damage, damaged plants, damaged other forms of life that were susceptible to intense amounts of ultraviolet radiation. So faced with this problem, the international community invokes something called the precautionary principle. We are not having enough evidence is not an excuse for not taking action. In other words, we weren't sure, we being the international community, we're not sure that the CFCs were actually destroying the ozone layer. We were pretty sure that that was the source of the problem, but we didn't have all the evidence in place to know for certain that this was the source of the problem. Nevertheless, the international community said, this is such a big deal, this is such a big threat, that we don't have time to wait around for complete and total certainty. We need to take steps now to deal with this problem. And so the international community, representatives of states, met in Montreal and came to an agreement called the Montreal Protocol, which abolished the use of most CFCs in things like hairspray and air conditioners and refrigerators and whatnot. This protocol was signed by most of the countries in the world, 146 in total, including the United States, and it's still in place today. And as a result of the Montreal Protocol, the threat of ozone depletion has been greatly reduced. CFC production has been reduced by 90%. Ozone depletion was once considered the most dire problem to the Earth. Now it's still a problem, it's still a concern, but notice that you almost never hear about it, which suggests that it's no longer high on the environmental agenda. And to deal with the fact that CFCs were now banned, the scientific community, the entrepreneurial community came up with new substances to replace the CFCs, and everything worked out in the end. So that's a hopeful sign that these kinds of problems can be solved. And indeed, at the end of 2015, we saw the international community come to an agreement on climate change in the form of the Paris Climate Accord. The agreement's somewhat complicated, and many argue that it lacks an enforcement mechanism, so it's mostly worthless words on the piece of paper, but the states who are part of it, and in this case, pretty much every state in the world, all agreed that they were going to commit themselves to the targets of the Paris Climate Accord. That the key point here, I think, is that first panel there and in the slide, that warming is going to be kept to below 2 degrees Celsius of pre-industrial norm. Remember, the Kyoto Protocol was 3 degrees Celsius, but that was back in 1999. The assumption here is 2015, we've already seen at least half a degree of warming, more likely a degree Celsius of warming. So we've already used up one of those 3 degrees in the Kyoto Protocol. So now the Paris Climate Accord only gives us a 2-degree margin of error. And it's going to accomplish this in the ways you see here. Notice that there is an allowance for developing countries to, quote unquote, pollute more based on their level of development, that developed states have a higher burden for limiting their production of greenhouse gases. And you can look at the slide and the details of the rest of the panels there and get a sense of what the agreement's about. But it does show that a consensus was reached on a very complicated problem. The postscript on this is that with the election of Donald Trump, he has promised to basically chuck this agreement, at least the American commitments to this agreement. Obviously, the United States can withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. That doesn't mean the rest of the world withdraws from it. And many countries have said they are going to keep their commitments regardless of the United States' actions. Okay, I want to switch gears here to the second half of this talk by focusing on security in terms of oceans and navigation. And here again, we're talking about a security threat that affects both states and human beings, both state security and human security. When we talk about oceans, we're talking about the various resources and interests that states have around oceans. Every state that has a coast has territorial waters. And it's in traditional state interest to protect those territorial waters, both in terms of protecting sovereignty and in terms of safeguarding the resources that might be available in those territorial waters. Related to that is the notion of free navigation, the idea that to maintain international trade, certain rights and privileges must be protected with regards to free navigation to allow trade to commence, and that states have an interest in protecting free navigation, especially at key choke points around the world, to maintain the health of the economy. But when we talk about oceans, there's also a human security angle to it, especially with regards to environmental concerns. We've covered a lot of that already, but in this part of the lecture, I do want to talk about fisheries a little bit, and we will in a few moments here. Then there's a third aspect that's very interesting and very new and evolving, and that's a new great power conflict that might be emerging with regards to the impact of climate change on the Arctic. And the fact that if the polar ice caps melt and stay melted to the point where ice no longer forms there, that opens up an area of the planet that hasn't really been claimed, or the agreements on who controls that area and what rights exist there for which states hasn't been fully fleshed out yet. So there's a possibility of a geopolitical struggle taking place there in the near future. Let's begin with the interest of states in protecting oceans with regards to state sovereignty. Here we're talking about the area of ocean immediately on the coast of a state. International law is quite clear here. Every state can consider the 12 miles beyond its coastline as territorial waters, which means it exercises power in that 12-mile zone in the same way it exercises sovereign power on land. Beyond that is what's called a 200-mile exclusive economic zone, where the state gets preferential rights in terms of economic exploitation with regards to fishing rights, with regards to mineral exploitation, with regards to any number of resources that can be harvested from this economic zone. Beyond this 200-mile exploitation zone, you have a set of treaties called the International Law of the Sea, which loosely governs, emphasis on the word loosely, how states interact with each other in open water. This isn't necessarily, hard and fast rules. There are general procedures and protocols that states ought to follow beyond the 200-mile economic zone. And if you've ever been on a cruise ship, you know how this works probably. The casinos, the bars tend to be closed when you're in port, especially the casinos. But once you get beyond those 12 miles, you're in international waters. International Law of the Sea doesn't have restrictions with regards to gambling, and so the casino's open at that point, regardless of what time of the day it is. The ships themselves may have internal rules about not being able to gamble if you're under 21 or whatever. Those are ships' rules. That's not in the International Law of the Sea. What the International Law of the Sea is most interested in is protecting the freedom of navigation because, as I've already mentioned, a robust international trade requires ships to be able to move around the world's oceans without interference or molestation. And this is important because 90% of all global commerce is transported via ship. Shipping, ocean liners, ocean container ships, these are the cheapest and cheapest ways of transporting durable goods. Yes, you can fly them on airplanes, but notice that airplanes can't hold that much and it's very, very expensive to ship stuff on air freight. So everything travels more or less by ship. Because of that, you need free navigation. And because everyone relies on trade these days, it's in the interest of pretty much every state to ensure that free navigation takes place. However, there are places around the world where navigation is threatened, not so much by states, but by non-state actors who have an interest in disrupting international shipping, and we'll talk about them here in a moment. Indeed, we can identify what we might call a handful of strategic waterways. These are areas where major shipping routes come very close to the coastline of particular countries. And in many places, like the Panama Canal and the Caribbean Sea, this isn't a big deal because none of these states have an interest in interfering with any of this shipping. But other parts of the world, as we'll identify a few here in a moment, have international shipping routes that come very close to coastlines where the states are not stable, suffer from internal strife, or are a haven for pirates. And these are areas where the international community has to focus a lot on maintaining security in order to ensure that these international shipping isn't disruptive. We're going to focus on the first three on this slide here, the Straits of Hormuz, the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb, and the Straits of Malacca. So let's begin with the Straits of Hormuz. This is the narrow waterway that separates the Indian Ocean from the Persian or Arabian Gulf. It is the route by which the vast majority of transported energy in the form of hydrocarbons, oil and natural gas pass, which makes it an extremely important waterway. And if this waterway isn't properly secured, it makes it easy for both states and non-state actors to disrupt the international flow of energy, causing prices to increase, threatening the energy supplies of certain states that rely heavily on imported energy. And so you can see why it's very important that this flow of shipping not be disrupted. In the past, when the United States and Iran have been at odds with each other, and I know they're at odds with each other most of the time, but things are relatively calm between these countries now. In the past, in the 1980s and 90s, things were a lot more intense, with oftentimes military actions and military maneuvers taking place, American naval vessels sinking, Iranian fast attack craft, Iranian special forces mining the Straits of Hormuz, trying to disrupt energy flows. Um, this has been a site of conflict in the past between Iran and the United States. Not so much anymore, but in the future, a future conflict between the United States and Iran, if it were to occur, would pose a threat to the stability of the Straits of Hormuz and the flow of energy that passes through there. A related area of interest is the Suez Canal. Its northern entrance up by Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, as I think we all know, is an artificial waterway. It was dug by the British and the French in the late 19th century. And in the past has been a site of conflict between Egypt and Israel and between Egypt and the European powers who attempted to seize the Suez Canal in the 1950s in order to protect it from being exploited by what they saw as an unfriendly Egyptian regime. So the Suez Canal has been a site of contestation in the past and could be a source of contestation in the future. On the other end of the Red Sea, you have the Bab el-Mandeb. The problem here is both with regards to the instability of Yemen, the country that's on the northern tip of the Bab, especially today with a civil war going on in Yemen, and the possibility of this area, the temptation for rebels in this area to attack shipping, to disrupt, or to use a bargaining chip to dissuade Saudi Arabia and the United States from assisting the government in putting down the rebellion. And on the other side, you have in the area Somalia. And Somalia has been a source of pirates, a place where pirates hide and hang out, waiting to ambush and take over and hijack ships that pass through this area, exiting the Red Sea. And finally, there's the Straits of Malacca, which is a narrow passageway between the Malay Peninsula and Indonesia, the large Sumatra island of Indonesia. And it's important to realize how important this waterway is with regards to international shipping, because Singapore is one of the busiest international ports in the world. Basically, every ship coming through the Indian Ocean goes through the Straits of Malacca and docks in Singapore. Now, while Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia don't have any interest in disrupting this trade, the island of Sumatra is largely undeveloped and provides a place for pirates and other non-state actors to hide and ambush shipping passing through this area. So this becomes problematic with regards to trying to secure this area from non-state actors and their attempts to seize cargoes and sell them on the black market or to ransom crews of international shipping concerns. I've referred to piracy a bit already, so let's go into a little bit more detail when we talk about pirates. The image that's conjured up when I talk about piracy is probably the classic notion of pirates or the notion that's promulgated in popular culture. It turns out that piracy was once considered an acceptable career choice, that many heroes of a nation, many explorers celebrated in our history books were in fact pirates. Sir Walter Raleigh, Sir Francis Drake, are celebrated as explorers discovering territory, discovering the New World or aspects of the New World. They were pirates. The reason why they were in these parts of the world is because they were trying to intercept, in the case of Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, Spanish ships that they believed were filled with gold and other resources. Even in the early days of the American colonial state, the richest people in these colonies in New England and whatnot, they were privateers, which is a fancy way of saying pirates. They had ships, they would go out, they would find merchant ships, ships that were, transporting goods and durable goods of some kind, and taking them over, taking the cargoes and reselling them simply for a profit. And this was considered, again, a legitimate career choice, a legitimate activity. But as we enter the 19th century and as international commerce increases, a real taboo begins to emerge with regards to pirates. It's no longer considered an acceptable activity. It's now no longer acceptable activity even for the state, which would oftentimes issue letters of marque that would allow pirates to go out and, in the name of a state, take over a merchant ship of their enemy and sell their goods for profit. You have the Declaration of Paris in 1856, which outlaws piracy outright. The U.S. does not sign this because the U.S. is still a rising state. It still requires or relies on the profits of piracy in order to raise revenues. So it doesn't sign this declaration. Obviously, in the modern day, piracy is universally condemned and has largely been eradicated with the exception of, as we'll see here in a moment, largely coastal raiders operating out of states that have ceased to exercise sovereignty over their coastal territory. Indeed, this is what we think of when we see piracy today. If you saw the movie Captain Phillips, you know this is a very illustrative example of what piracy looks like today, where you have criminal gangs who, again, will attack and seize cargoes to resell, or in the case of Somali pirates off the coast of Somalia in the Gulf of Aden, they will take control of container ships, not because they can resell the cargo because they're locked away in containers, but they'll take the crews, they'll kidnap them and hold them for ransom and wait for the shipping companies that own these ships to pay them a large, substantial amount of money to release these crews and send them back to their homes, hopefully without any type of, without any kind of injury or damage to them. This became such a problem a few years ago that you saw a substantial naval presence brought into the Gulf of Aden and the coastal waters off of Somalia to deal specifically with these pirates, who still persist to this day, although, again, the problem has been largely curbed because of the presence of large navies there. Ironically, the pirates that we just got done discussing, one of the reasons why they turned to piracy is because their primary job, their primary means of sustenance was fishing, but they don't fish anymore. And the reason why they don't fish anymore is because we are seeing a precipitous drop in the fisheries around the world. This is very important because, as we've already discussed, much of the world lives on the coasts, and as a result, they rely on the sea for their nutrition and caloric intake requirements. But as the chart here shows, we're seeing a huge drop in the ability of fisheries to sustain themselves. Over half the world's fisheries are, as of right now, fully exploited, with a substantial amount beyond that overexploited, which means that they don't have the ability to sustain themselves anymore. Indeed, some of these stocks are fully depleted, which means they won't be able to recover. Only a very small amount of fisheries around the world can be said to be sustainable, that they're either overexploited but recovering, moderately exploited and sustainable, or underexploited. Notice that underexploited represents 3%. That's not very much. So for these fishermen, one of the reasons why they become pirates is because there's no fish to catch anymore, or there are restrictions on the fish that they catch in order to protect the fishing stocks. And again, this is important because from a human security point of view, fish are the #1 source of animal protein in the world. Fish are by far the cheapest and most abundant and easily accessible source of animal protein. And so as a result of this, in order to protect this source of food and for the purpose of protecting the species in general, lots of laws have been drafted, lots of restrictions exist, both at national and international levels, that place limits on how much fish you can catch, how much fish these fishermen can catch. The problem is that they're almost impossible to enforce because the ocean's a big place. These fishermen and these fishing boats are very small. And certain states, a lot of states, especially in the developing world, just don't have the ability, have the resources or the finances to go out and actually enforce these laws, whether, again, they're international or national. So despite the existence of these laws, a lot of fishermen go out and they will catch they'll catch fish from stocks that are protected because that's their way of life, that's all they know, and they have no alternative. I want to conclude by discussing briefly certain parts of the world and certain parts of the world's oceans that are becoming a focus of geopolitical rivalry. Part of this is due to the emergence or reemergence of powerful states that are developing capabilities to project power on the high seas. And here we're talking about China and Russia, which don't have the same naval capacities as the United States, but are interested in developing them and in consolidating control of their own ocean near their territory. Here we can focus on the Western Pacific with regards to China, and with regards to Russia, we can focus on the Arctic Ocean and the emerging ability for states to exploit the resources of the Arctic Ocean due to the melting ice caps. When we talk about the rising China, notice that here the Pacific Ocean is the primary source of tension. Most of these locations are the Western Pacific, the area off the coast of China where other states, mostly island states, make claims. So in the case of the Kuriil Islands, which is up north, the north set of islands in the larger chain of Japan. These are islands that are claimed both by Japan and China, and in the past have been, or excuse me, by Russia and Japan, and have been a source of conflict between these two states in the past. In terms of Japan and China, another set of islands are the source of conflict there. What the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands are disputed. Again, Japan and China both claim these islands as part of their sovereign territory. And further south in the South China Sea, you have the Spratly Islands, which are disputed by a handful of countries, including China, Vietnam, Brunei, and the Philippines. In fact, here, the Chinese are actually building their own islands, their own artificial reefs that they will use to make sovereign claims on some of these islands. Because if you remember, you get 12 miles of ocean off your sovereign territory, your sovereign land. If you can build a small island, an airstrip or a port, and claim it as your own sovereign territory, and some of these islands would lay within 12 miles of this artificial pseudo island you're building, well, that gives you a sovereign claim of those islands that other states may not be able to match. And so there's a lot of controversy going on here with regards to what role the United States should play in checking what appears to be an expansionary project by the Chinese in the South China Sea. But by far, I think the most interesting example of oceans as a source of rivalry is the Arctic Ocean, where again, melting ice caps are going to make the Arctic Sea navigable, I should say, for international shipping. They also allow for the exploitation of seabed resources that were no longer easily reachable when you had a thick layer of ice that was permanently placed in the North Pole. Russia is so interested in exploiting these resources that, as you can see by this picture, they actually sent a submersible to the bottom of the Arctic Ocean, right around the North Pole, and they placed a little flag there as a way of making a claim on the North Pole as being sovereign Russian territory. But it turns out that Russia is just one state that has claims on the Arctic, that Canada is very, very interested and very, very forceful in making claims on the Arctic being largely within the purview of Canadian sovereignty. Obviously, the United States has an interest here with Alaska and the North Slope of Alaska jutting into the Arctic Sea. Denmark, of all countries, has a claim here because Greenland is a territory of Denmark. Then you have Norway, which has its North Cape is part of the calculus here. As recently as 2011, an Arctic treaty was signed among these 5 states, which attempted to address some of these issues. But the only issue they could come to a complete agreement on was the obligation that all states have to engage in search and rescue responsibilities if someone calls for help. Regardless of where they are, all states have responsibility to come to the aid of a ship's crew that's in some kind of trouble. Beyond that, as you can see from the slide here, the Russians claim a big chunk of territory, and other states are not entirely in agreement that this is Russian territory. A lot of this stuff needs to be worked out in terms of which parts of the Arctic are part of which nation's sovereign control. And it'll be interesting to see in the future how this is all worked out. So stay tuned.